World of Warfare presents Great Deceptions in Military History. All warfare is based on deception. Sun Tzu wrote in his ancient Chinese military treatise, The Art of War, which today remains words of gospel for military strategists, businessmen, and lawyers alike. Although deception in human warfare dates back to the earliest written accounts, for instance, the Battle of Gaugamela in 1331 BC, the Battle of the Hydaspes River in 1326 BC, the Battle of Lake Trasimene in 217 BC, Cannae during the Second Punic War of 218 to 201 BC, the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223, the destruction of the USS Philadelphia in the First Barbary War of 1801 to 1805, and Murat's 1805 seizure of the Danube Bridge. And while these deceptions merit significant study, this film focuses on some of the most spectacular and audacious deceptions in recorded human history. Although the lines between true history and mythology cause frequent debate amongst academics, the Trojan War was a Bronze Age running battle between the kingdoms of Troy and Mycenaean Greece, forever cemented in early literature by ancient writers such as Herodotus, Sophocles, Virgil, and Homer, the later recounting the Trojan Wars some 400 years after the fact in the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Trojan War began after the abduction or elopement of Queen Helen of Sparta by Trojan Prince Paris, whose jilted husband Menelaus convinced his brother Agamemnon to lead a massive expedition to retrieve her. Joined by the warrior likes of Achilles, Odysseus, Nestor, and Ajax, the war party was accompanied by more than 1,000 ships from the Hellenic world, who sailed across the Aegean Sea to demand Helen's return by Priam, the king of the Trojans. Over the next 10 years, the Trojan War would see pitched battles and random skirmishes, which led to the storied deaths of Trojan Prince Hector and the nearly invincible Achilles. The war came to an end when the Greeks retreated from the gates of Troy, but not before leaving a gift of a large wooden horse. The horse caused much debate by Trojan leaders, including unheeded warnings by Priam's daughter Cassandra, and after the massive gift was pulled inside the city walls of Troy, upon nightfall, Greek warriors led by Odysseus climbed out of the horse to lay siege upon Troy from within. After the Trojans' defeat, Odysseus and his men took another 10 years to make their way home to Ithaca, as recounted in Homer's Odyssey. As for Helen of Troy, the sole ignition point of so much protracted bloodshed, after 2 successive Trojan husbands were killed during the war, she returned to reign with Menelaus until his death. After Menelaus was no more, some historians believe she was exiled to the island of Rhodes, where Menelaus's vengeful war widow had her put to death, bringing new meaning to the old adage, "Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned." During the American Civil War, Quakers known as Friends had to decide which was the greater sin, violence or slavery. Quakerism preached against both, leaving its subjects in opposition to the South's peculiar institution, but unwilling to take up arms against the Confederacy. Friends were forced to choose between isolation from their faith or their communities, leaving those who refused to take up arms labeled as unpatriotic cowards on both sides of the conflict. Some, like Southerner Delphina Mendenhall, held firm to her faith, welcoming starved and tattered Union soldiers into her home to offer aid and compassion. Others at the front lines of war resorted to what became known as Quaker Guns, which were painted logs and staged earthworks made up to look like cannon. One such example occurred on September 28th of 1861, after Confederate forces retreated from Munson's Hill, Virginia, where Union scouts reported 3 Parrott guns in a shallow ditch. Instead, when Union soldiers crossed the now collapsed Confederate line, They found 2 logs and 1 stovepipe, each possessing precious little firepower. During Major General George B. McClellan's Peninsula Campaign of 1862, McClellan refused repeated demands by President Lincoln to advance on Richmond, instead believing scouting reports that 100,000 Confederate soldiers had amassed at Manassas Junction, supported by more than 300 artillery pieces in defense of the Confederate line. In truth, Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston employed Quaker Guns in fake troop encampments to enlarge the footprint of his 40,000-man force, a critical ruse that allowed Johnston to evacuate the Manassas-Centerville line in defense of the Confederate capital. During the 4+ bloody years of the First World War, German advances in submarine warfare wreaked havoc and high anxiety on naval and merchant ships alike, sinking over 6,000 Allied vessels for a total loss of 14,200,000 tons. Led by British Rear Admiral Gordon Campbell, to counter the ongoing U-boat menace, the British employed an assortment of mystery Q-ships, disguising their hidden war assets within scruffy-looking timber ships, tramp freighters, passenger liners, fishing smacks, and slow-moving sailing luggers. Hoisting the colors of neutral nations, Q-ships were fitted with false funnels, while guns were hidden conveniently inside chicken coops and other deck cargo, all in an attempt to lure German U-boat crews in for a closer look, before shedding their masquerade in a fusillade of deadly gunfire. While U-boats posed a deadly threat to maritime traffic, Q-ship crews took open advantage of a U-boat's inherent limitations. Carried in limited supply within the tight confines of a U-boat, torpedoes were only accurate from a relatively short distance from their intended prey, making them vulnerable to return fire or even ramming should an attacking U-boat surface too soon near an enemy ship. To lure U-boats into their trap, Q-ships conducted staged panic parties, as Admiral Campbell described in his memoir, My Mystery Ships. Dressed as common deckhands and even women in the case of Q-ship passenger liners, during a panic party, crew and passengers would pretend to abandon a sinking ship, opening fire when a U-boat had drawn sufficiently near, before dropping depth charges when desperate U-boat crews dove for safer waters. Led by professional naval officers, Q-ship crews had to act their parts on a 24/7 basis, oftentimes changing ship names, nationalities, and deck silhouettes from one port to the next. On one occasion, even Campbell's fellow officers failed to recognize him behind his bearded, scruffy persona when he disguised himself as the skipper of a timber ship. Oftentimes, when participants in a panic party took to their lifeboats, they frequently carried a stuffed parrot in a cage, furthering the authenticity of the trap, since merchant crews routinely kept parrots as shipboard mascots and pets, making Q-ships of World War I some of the gutsiest deceptions in the age of modern warfare. After Germany signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union in August of 1939, replete with secret plans to divide Czechoslovakia upon Germany's planned invasion, on June 22, 1941, more than 3 million German and Axis troops invaded Russia along an 1,800-mile front, shooting down more than 1,000 Soviet aircraft on the first day alone. Codenamed Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's plan called for the genocidal elimination of Russians and Ukrainians from their homelands, creating his envisioned Lebensraum, or living space, for the future growth of his supposedly genetically superior German race. Despite the arrival across his borders of the most powerful invasion force in the history of human warfare, some 80% of all Wehrmacht assets, Stalin and his Red Army were caught flat-footed and unprepared, as Panzer tank divisions and Luftwaffe bombardments gave Germany an early lead against the Soviets' numerous yet poorly trained troops. Moving with the same blitzkrieg speed that saw every nation but Great Britain fall in less than 6 weeks' time, advancing German forces were followed by SS death squads known as Einsatzgruppen, who sought out and killed Russian civilians, with a particular emphasis on Soviet Jews, while Hitler's Commissar order authorized the immediate execution of all Soviet prisoners of war, in direct violation of international war protocols like the Geneva Convention. German forces also met with heavy casualties, as the Soviets' numerical advantage and stiff civilian resistance took its toll on the Wehrmacht. Halting his attack on Moscow against protests from his generals, Hitler ordered his forces into resource-rich Ukraine, which fell to the Nazis by the end of September 1941. After cutting Leningrad off from the rest of Russia, when his forces proved insufficient to take the city itself, Hitler ordered a siege of starvation, which would last for some 872 days. Due to the length of the German front line created in their 1942 summer offensive, with its ultimate goal of taking Stalingrad and the oil fields of the Caucasus, Axis forces were badly overextended, made worse by the German High Command's decision to transfer several mechanized divisions from Russia into Western Europe. While Hitler and his High Command believed that the Soviets were too weak to put up another fight, in truth, the Red Army had secretly deployed over 1 million new reinforcements in the defense of Stalingrad. While men like the Wehrmacht's Sixth Army Commander General Friedrich Paulus saw the reality of the Soviets' buildup, none of his urgent pleas for support were taken seriously by Hitler and his High Command, leading to the coming rout for the German army. By the start of Operation Uranus on November 19, 1942, the Soviets had amassed 1,143,500 troops and support personnel, along with 894 tanks and 13,451 artillery pieces, against the Germans' 400,000-man army, replete with 134 tanks and 827 artillery pieces. Beginning at 7:20 a.m. Moscow time, the Soviets attacked the northern flank of the Germans' Stalingrad line, followed by attacks on the Germans' southern flank the following day. By late on November 22nd, Soviet forces had linked up at the town of Kalash, trapping some 290,000 Axis forces east of the Don River. The Germans' retreat from Stalingrad littered roads with weapons, helmets, and some 10,000 abandoned trucks, leaving all bridges over the Don River jammed with Axis soldiers who made their way west atop the frozen Russian landscape. Those Axis soldiers weakened by injury or cold or hunger were simply trampled to death in the rush to evacuate, while many who attempted to cross the frozen river on foot fell through and drowned. Starving Axis troops looted Russian villages and supply dumps until the last stragglers crossed the Don River on November 24th, destroying the bridge while sealing the fate of those Axis personnel snared by the Soviets' deceptive arms buildup. As rightly predicted by Axis war leaders in the field, the German Sixth Army, along with Romania's Third and Fourth Armies, were all but annihilated, leading to the surrender of 91,000 Axis troops, despite Hitler's orders to fight to the death. Early in the war effort, Allied leaders were in agreement on the conditions leading up to D-Day, supremacy over the Luftwaffe, and the need for the element of surprise to catch the Germans off guard. By the time of Operation Bodyguard, Britain had built a formidable network of intelligence agencies aimed at misleading Hitler and his war machine. First conceived during the Tehran Conference on December 28, 1943, Winston Churchill said to Joseph Stalin, "In wartime, truth is so precious that she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies." From that phrase, the name Operation Bodyguard was born. Within its tenets of complexity was Operation Fortitude, which witnessed false troop buildups in the Balkans, Sweden, the Mediterranean, and the Pas-de-Calais region of France. While Hitler had demanded an Atlantic wall of fortification along 1,500 miles of the Western European coastline, his crews were still far shy of building fortifications across northern France, which left the European mainland exposed to invasion from forces crossing the English Channel from Great Britain. As a result, Operation Fortitude branched off in two separate objectives. Fortitude North worked on creating a build-up illusion in Norway, while the more important Fortitude South built its illusion around the Pas-de-Calais region of France. To add to the deception, the Allies created the British Fourth Army stationed in Scotland and led by Lieutenant General Andrew Thorne, creating a mass buildup of decoy tanks, transports, planes, and buildings, along with fake radio transmissions that leaked plans of a northern assault on mainland Europe. The arrival of highly esteemed General Sir Bernard Montgomery into Scotland lent an additional persuasive authenticity for German spies in the UK. To further the rouse, the Allies created the First United States Army Group, or FUSAGE, under the command of General George S. Patton, since the American commander was held in high regard by the Nazis due to his aggressive battle tactics. Stationed in southeastern England, all leaked radio traffic indicated that FUSAGE's ultimate insertion point would be at Pas-de-Calais. As for Pas-de-Calais itself, temporary buildings were erected along with faux landing craft known as Big Bobs, stationed in harbors and bays along the coastline, along with faux tanks, planes, transport vehicles, and fake soldiers, while at Normandy, military buildings were cleverly disguised as cafes and shops. Another sub-operation of Bodyguard was Operation Pluto, which concealed the construction of an underwater oil pipeline across the English Channel to support the Allies' eventual push for Berlin. On the night between the 5th and 6th of June 1944, the biggest armada ever assembled made its way towards the French coast. Hitler went to bed at 4 a.m., and at 6 in the morning, the fleet is spotted and combat engaged. German generals immediately called the Chief of Staff, fearing that the armada was the dreaded invasion so many had anticipated. Not wanting to awaken the sleeping Führer, Hitler was woken up at 10 in the morning by his camp aide. Yet Hitler is convinced that the attack on Normandy is nothing more than a diversion from the real landing at Pas-de-Calais. He refuses to send reinforcements, much like his miscalculations at Stalingrad. Instead, the inflatable rubber decoys of Operation Fortitude diverted all attacks from the 5 Normandy beachheads. Hitler ordered reinforcements at 2:30 in the afternoon, a good 8 hours after the armada was sighted. Winston Churchill landed at Normandy sometime later, which didn't take long for the British Prime Minister to satisfy himself that all was going well. The art of deception reached a new zenith during World War II, when a group of artists, engineers, and regular enlisted men concocted one of the most convincing deceptions in human history. Coinciding with the D-Day invasions at Normandy, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was the first mobile multimedia tactical deception unit in U.S. Army history, consisting of 1,023 enlisted men and 82 officers split into 3 units: visual, audio, and radio deception. The brainchild of Colonel Billy Harris and Major Ralph Ingersoll, the Ghost Army's objective was to amplify their presence to that of 2 divisions of 30,000 men, effectively distracting the Germans away from actual troop buildups along combat fronts. Among their ranks were such future notables as fashion designer Bill Blass, painter Ellsworth Kelly, and photographer Art Kane, who helped in the design of blow-up rubber tanks, artillery, and aircraft, even using bulldozers to make fake tank tracks in an effort to deceive aerial reconnaissance flyovers. Knowing German spies were everywhere in France after the Nazis' 4-year occupation, The Ghost Army also sent groups into French towns, masquerading as tank division officers that were nowhere near the area, causing knee-jerk reactions within the German high command. Undertaking 21 deception missions from June of 1944 to the end of the war in Europe, their most important mission was Operation Bettenburg, which took place along the Moselle River, bordering France and Germany. Embedded into a front line hundreds of miles long, when General George S. Patton got wind of a 75-mile gap in Allied defenses, the Ghost Army filled the exposed region with a massive and protracted deception, beginning on September 16, 1944. Arriving under the cover of darkness, the Ghost Army used amplified mobile speakers to mimic the sounds of approaching tanks, jeeps, and light-armored troop carriers, along with elaborate radio communications that further deceived the Germans regarding the presence of a massive Allied troop buildup. When the Germans responded with troop buildups of their own to face off against the mounting Allied threat, the 83rd Division took advantage of the Germans' shift in manpower to relieve the Ghost Army of their remarkable 7-day deception, making the Ghost Army one of the greatest deceits in the history of human warfare.